And then you have this. So you'd have to be an ostrich with your head under a stone to not have gotten the sense that honeybees are somehow in trouble. Here's a cover of Time magazine declaring we better find out what's killing our honeybees or we're all in trouble. And there's an extreme dire outlook for humans and bees. And of course the idea is some of the myths that have been promulgated. One is that if we did lose honeybees for whatever reason, humans would starve within weeks because of food production. I've heard this many times. I've actually seen it on documentaries, and it's just startling because it's just not true. So let's just look at some of the myths. I at least wanted to clear up 3 of them before we go on to talk about how to protect pollinators. So the first one is, let's talk about where this kind of stemmed from. If you look at colony numbers since 1990 in the United States, we've been actually relatively stable with just some minor bumps here or there. And there was an episode beginning in 2006 and then going to 2010 that was called colony collapse disorder. And that was because there was a few beekeepers who lost 90% of their bees. And we're talking literally a handful of guys. And they accounted for that little blip you see there about 2008 to 2009. And that's the whole thing that started the press, colony collapse disorder. But if you look at from a scientist's point of view, when you look at those numbers, that's just a very minor dip. And in fact, some scientists, I should say, wondered if there was even a real problem or not, because it's a fairly part of the natural variation of that plot. So that's what triggered a lot of the press coverage. Colony collapse disorder, or CCD, is what you hear about. And there was an investigation. The federal government spent about $5 or $6 million looking into this event to try and figure out what was going wrong. And naturally what they found is a lot of things kill bees and make them unhealthy. The ones in red here are the ones that are always primarily associated with the death of honeybee colonies. And that's the Varroa mite and the viruses it vectors to the bees. But pesticides, a fungal disease called nosema, and then all kinds of chemical residues, insecticides and pesticides, were found in hives everywhere. And then diet, and what I mean here is there were some colonies we know that were under nutritional stress because they were in drought areas where flowering plants were not abundant, so they weren't getting the food they need. I've already told you they really need pollen. And so these bees were stressed, and then the fact that we put these bees on trucks and transport them across the country for thousands of miles really stresses bees. Bees were meant to be in trees that don't move, and when you move their trees for thousands of miles, you stress bees. And all these contributed to the declining health of bees during this episode. And what's interesting is in the press, pesticides became the primary suspect of killing bees. But if you ask just about any bee scientist in the United States, and it's this mite, this reddish brown mite on the back of the bee, it's on the center of the back of that bee, is the Varroa mite. That is the major killer of bees in the world. And I don't want to get too down to the biology of it, but I want to tell you how this mite kills the bees. Basically, it invades the brood cell. The honeybee raises its young in combs, and the young go through the same stages as the butterfly. They have the egg stage, a larval stage, which looks like a little white maggot, and then they have a pupal stage, and then that pupa will emerge out of the comb and be an adult bee. So you have egg, larva, pupa, adult. This mite, what it does, it sneaks into the brood cell with a larva, hides underneath the larva, and one thing I haven't told you yet is when the larva gets ready to pupate, the adult bees put a brown cap on the brood to protect it. So the mite is sneaking in before that protection goes on. And once the protection goes on, the mite starts feeding on the baby bee. And it starts sucking its blood, and it uses that nutrition to raise its own family. It lays eggs every 30 hours. The baby mites and mama mite feed on that developing bee, and what they end up doing is vectoring viral diseases to our bees. And they vector more than 20 viruses, and it's the viruses that kill the bees. So that's what is the big killer of honeybees in the United States. And so, just to round out the colony collapse disorder, to let you know it's overblown, if you look right now, we're almost at 83 million colonies of bees in the world. is where we are now. So the numbers don't justify the concern. Honeybee colonies are actually growing in our beekeeping operations around the world. You can see in this plot there is a big dip there if you look in the early to mid 90s. That dip is when Varroa mites were first brought into the United States and Canada. We lost millions of colonies to that mite, but we're recovering. Now, I don't want to say that health in honeybees is not a problem. Our beekeepers have to work harder than they've ever had to work before to keep their bees alive. To keep these numbers up, they have to basically invest more production cost, because since the 90s, we got two parasitic mites. I mentioned the worst one is the Varroa mite, but we got another mite that lives in their airway. We got a beetle that basically invades their colonies and destroys their combs, and we got a fungal disease. And we never had to deal with these problems in the United States until about 25 to 30 years ago. And all these problems have added up, and that our beekeepers have to spend more to keep their bees alive and healthy. And that's really the main problem with beekeeping. And then pesticides are just an added problem we've always had.